Okay, so welcome everybody to the second NDCAP meeting. I really appreciate your attendance and the panelists' participation. I think we'll do this probably for a few more times, but let's go around and introduce ourselves and say who we're representing as members of the panel. I'll start over here with Representative Dean.
David Dean, appointed by Speaker of the House, Shep Smith, live in Westminster.
Derek Jordan, appointed by Shep Smith, also. I live in East Dummerston.
Steve Skibniowski, I was appointed by the Board of Selectmen of the town of Vernon and representing the town of Vernon.
Chris Camp, Executive Director of the Vernon Regional Commission.
John Brookman, I'm the General Counsel for the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm here on behalf of David Mears, who's the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Commissioner Mears couldn't be here tonight, appointed by Governor Shumlin.
I'm Pat Moulton-Powden. I'm Secretary of the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development.
And I'm Chris Recchia. I'm Commissioner of the Department of Public Service and your chair for at least a little while.
I'm Representative Mike Hebert. I represent Guilford and Vernon, and I serve on the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee, and that is my function here. I was appointed by the Speaker to be the representative to that committee.
I'm Kate O'Connor, and I'm from Brattleboro, and I am an appointee of Governor Shumlin.
Martin Langeveld, I live in Vernon, also appointed by the governor.
I'm Jim Matto, I live in Westminster, citizen panel member appointed by Senator Campbell.
Jim Tonkovich, I live in Wilder, also appointed by Senator Campbell.
Mike Toomey, I live in Connecticut. I work at the White Plains, New York office of Entergy. I'm one of the two appointees from Entergy Nuclear, Vermont Yankee.
Chris Wamser, I'm the site vice president at Vermont Yankee.
Great, thank you. And we are missing Representative Paul Mark and David Andrews tonight. We also are missing Dr. Bill Irwin. Although now that I'm saying that, I'm thinking maybe I'm supposed to actually connect a phone here for him to.
No, that's taken care of. He's over here.
He's over there? Okay, yeah. Great. Hi, Bill. Can you hear us at all?
Bill, can you hear that?
Actually, I thought that Commissioner Recchia was speaking, and unfortunately, that was the only microphone I could not hear.
Excellent, excellent. All right, Bill, we'll do our best to speak up. It does seem like I'm the only one with a microphone, and these guys might wrestle me for it, but I think we just all need to make sure we're speaking up. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of people that are here. Joe Flynn, Director of Emergency Management Planning for the state. Hi, Eric Vernon with him, also there. I see Aaron Jasicki, who's one of our legal counsel in the public advocacy office, who's helping on nuclear issues for me, and Tony Lashinsky, who's our nuclear engineer and administrator of this panel, and doing a great job considering I don't think nuclear engineering included taking minutes in his coursework. So thank you all so much for being here. The first order of business is to look at last month's meeting minutes and to see if there are any changes or to adopt those. One thing I want to say about these minutes is we did do a little investigation to see if we were subject to the new law that requires that minutes be posted promptly and things, and we are. So we are doing that. They will be on our website within 5 days of a meeting, but they'll be draft until the committee gets back together and approves them. So I hope everybody understands that and has access to it. So I guess with the current consideration of the minutes, I take a motion to approve and in a second, and then we can discuss them.
I'll move.
Thank you. Thank you. So, and Tony, are you getting who's moving and seconding, or do I need to repeat that?
I did not record it last time, so okay. I don't know if that's if that needs to be recorded.
Yeah, it's part of the deal.
We can pull it off the video.
Okay, all right. Well, we will work on that, but I'll try and keep track of that and get you notes. So, okay, so open for discussion. Any comments or changes?
One question, Chris.
Yes.
What is the protocol, or have we decided if you weren't present whether or not you should vote on the minutes?
Right. The rules are that you actually can vote on them. My preference would be that you abstain from them unless you wish to vote on them. But I think that's cleaner. But in fact, the rules allow you to vote on minutes of meetings that you didn't attend, which I find to be interesting. So my preference would be that you abstain, but you do what your heart desires. Any other changes or questions on the minutes? This is very unusual to call on an audience member at this time, but I will do so because you look like you really want to say something.
Well, because we're at the beginning formation stages. I was really impressed to see the public comments included as part of the minutes.
Okay.
And I saw where it said public comments to be added later.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how you would.
Okay, so commenting on that, there was a second set of minutes that are actually where public comments were kind of characterized and put in. But truthfully, it was a heroic effort, and it's going to require much more of Tony's time than I would ideally like to see. So I guess what I would ask is that we stick with the minutes the way they normally are supposed to be done, which is for decisions made by the panel, and that people source the video, which we are contracting for, to make sure it's available and here for people to get actual comments. That would be a lot easier for our administrative aspects of it. But thank you. Any other comments or changes? Okay. All those in favor of approving the minutes from September 25th meeting signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions?
I'll abstain.
I will too.
Okay. 3 abstentions. Thank you. Thanks, folks. Okay, so the next thing that we've been working on is Catherine Morris from CBI, who introduced herself last time, has been contracting with us to help with, she's from the Consensus Building Institute, that's what CBI stands for, to help with kind of managing this process as we learn and go forward and help facilitate things that we think maybe need to be done. And one of the things we identified was that beyond the statutory charge we have, that perhaps there should be a charter or interim ground rules for meeting that I would like her to present to you guys, and then we can talk about them, and whether or not you're ready to adopt them or not, we can either decide that or postpone until next meeting. But Catherine, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Is this one working? You guys hear me?
Keep talking, maybe.
Hello?
Yeah, now it's turned off.
Hold on.
Now does it work?
Hold on 1 second. I try not to kill myself as I come out here. It was working before.
I think it is working, it's just not very well.
Okay.
All right,
I'm sorry.
I'll talk
I can do something about
right
that.
into it.
Yeah, speak as though you don't have a microphone.
Okay.
Probably the better.
Well, as Commissioner Recchia said, I was asked to help at this meeting, and I should clarify that CBI is working with grant funding from the Linslack Foundation, so I'd like to just thank them for their support. One of the things that we typically do, the CBI does, our job is to help facilitate collaborative problem solving. There you go, it's working. Is to, particularly groups that are going to be ongoing, like this one, is to try to set forth in writing just your working protocols, how you're going to work together, clarify any questions about issues that we're going to bring up here. There you go. Issues about your duties, issues about alternates, this is sort of the outline of what I put into this charter, most of which actually is specified pretty clearly in the legislation that created you. So a lot of this is not really up for discussion, but what I have done is amended it with a number of additional provisions that you might want to think about. And I would just recommend that tonight this is a point for discussion and clarification, and that you not actually make any decisions tonight, because Well, for one reason, because you will ultimately have the opportunity to make changes or propose changes to the legislation if you so desire, and that should also be incorporated into your charter. So I would suggest that you consider it tonight, and we'll talk about what the procedures might be for making any future changes or considering it in more detail, but that you not actually finalize it for another month or two. So that's the overview. These are the aspects that were very clearly delineated in the legislation, what your purpose is, what your duties are, who is a member, and some of the administrative aspects of the NDCAP. There were some aspects that you might want to consider including beyond that. And I did send a draft charter out to each of you, and I'm hoping it was put up on the website for the public. So as we go through this, I just ask you to consider, I don't know if anybody brought a copy, but look at the specific language in the draft charter, and I have page numbers as references, so you can do that. So the first issue that I would suggest you think about is including a provision under your duties that allows you to do whatever you decide you want to do. So in addition to what you are required to do, a simple sentence that says other duties consistent with statutory charge as adopted by majority of the panelists. That leaves it pretty open-ended, and it gives you a little bit more discretion. And we had 15 minutes for the panelists to ask questions. I would encourage you to go ahead and ask questions or raise any points of clarification as we go through this, rather than waiting till the end. Alternates. There isn't a provision in the legislation for how you should deal with alternates. We have alternates here tonight. We had alternates at the last meeting. I think it's worthwhile stating that alternates are in fact either allowed or not. And there are pros and cons to both of those. This is a pretty large group and we'll be meeting fairly intensively. So if you consider alternates, I think what that does is it puts the obligation on the member, the panelist, to simply make sure that they're up to date and that they're keeping that alternate well informed about where you are in the process. I would definitely recommend that if you have language in there that allows alternates, that you make it clear that there should be one official designated alternate per person, so that you don't have like a number of different people stepping in and out of the process, which would make it very difficult, particularly in decision making. And you might also want to consider actually putting language in there about the role of the alternate in the circumstances where a decision has to be made. Do they have full authority to act on behalf of the member they're representing to vote in the circumstances where you are making decisions? Any thoughts about that? Any comments at this point?
You have a suggestion that you're suggesting that a number be put in to limit how many times in a year, how many meetings that could be. And this is not a question discussion. I don't know if you want these all at the same time, but I was just thinking that we might want to think in terms of, in a given year, if the panel only met the minimum of 4 times, the maximum number of meetings for an alternate should relate to that, like 2 out of the 4 or something. So then if we meet 6, it's still only 2. Just you wouldn't want it to be all 4.
Right.
Yep.
I am a citizen rep.
Yes.
We have other people who are citizen reps. Are we, do people, I guess I don't know how to say it, but why do certain people get to have alternates while some of us don't? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it is me or nobody. So I guess I'm wondering why, and Pat's here, so I won't brag on her, but the secretary or the commissioner can have an alternate, but that's sort of, to me, a fairness issue.
It is a fair question. I will say that the statute did say that for the secretaries and commissioners, it could be or their designees. So But that doesn't necessarily imply alternates. So I think it's a fair question, and we could talk about it. And until cloning is readily available, I would agree that, it's really you as a citizen member. You can't pick an alternate to come. So
Right, and I have a job and other things, just like.
yeah. So I think that's a fair discussion, and maybe there shouldn't be alternates. We can talk about that.
And I think it may depend on which member, because we're all here, not all of us, but some of us are here in different capacities.
Right.
The governor has the right to appoint certain members that he does by name. The Entergy Nuclear Vermont Yankee has a right to name 2 members, and it can change those 2 members, whenever it wants to. And then you've got the specific provision of the agency heads who are explicitly allowed to send an alternate. So I don't know that a single rule really works for this panel, because we're all situated in different stations.
Yeah. But it's a good thought, and we should think about that.
Committee assignments, there's no specific language that says that you should create committees. My experience has been in working particularly with advisory groups like this that have an extended life and will have a number of issues that require fairly intensive joint learning, that it benefits the group the advisory panel, to be able to appoint work groups that can come do some of that work offline or between meetings, come to you with recommendations, and allow you then to consider those decisions based on a subgroup that has done a lot of the research and a lot of the analysis of the pros and cons of those decisions. So, for instance, at the end of this conversation, you might want to consider having a governance committee that goes off and takes the input from tonight's discussion, as well as any further comments you can get, and continues to work on this charter, is a standing group that might work through to the point where we have recommendations to the legislature about any further changes. The question here is, 1, do you want to have that kind of authority to delegate some of your work to committees? 2, how do those committees get set up? At whose discretion? Who decides when you need a committee? And who decides who's going to be on that committee? In the language that I've included in the charter, it says that the chair has the discretion to appoint the committee. The committee is still working on at the discretion of the whole NDCAP, and that every effort should be made to try to make that committee reflective of the interests that are represented on the NDCAP as a whole, so that you don't have a subcommittee populated only by state officials, obviously, or only by citizens. So. That's just a proposal, a standing proposal for your consideration, and you may want to think about how many members specifically you would put on a committee. If they're working on your behalf, they're not making decisions, mind you, but they are going to be meeting, and do all of those meetings have to be open if it's 5 members, if it's 4 members, if it's 8 members. There might be some consideration of having those meetings open, depending on the size of the group. There is at the bottom of page 3, I believe, I'm not sure if I have the right page number, but there is a provision in here as well about, I think I took this from, I was looking at a number of different charters, one of which was the Vermont Yankee Citizen Advisory Panel, and they have a specific date at which they will no longer be a standing entity. And, I got everything from, 2050 as a suggested sunset date to 2015. So I think there's something in there, something perhaps in between, but you may want to consider putting a specific date in there since it's not specified.
If I could, I don't think that's in the purview of this panel.
Yeah, one of the suggestions I had when I saw it earlier drafted this was just ensure that we understand that the legislature is who decides how long we do this for.
I mean, could make a recommendation at this point. That would be fine.
Yeah.
But it's law. It's been through both branches of the government.
Yes.
And I agree with that. I didn't say anything at the first issue, but I think the same consideration applies to expanding the scope of what the committee looks at, because I think the legislation was pretty specific. And I would have the same concerns that the representative expressed about the ability of the committee to decide that it can look at other things, because I think the legislature made that decision.
Yeah, Chris.
So, Mike, just to clarify, so you have concerns about being able to create subcommittees to look at?
No, not the subcommittee. It's the very first thing we talked about.
Gotcha, okay.
About the overall scope of the panel, and I can't remember what the...
It was other duties consistent with statutory charge.
Gotcha.
There is that clause that says it has to be generally consistent with the charge of the legislation.
Okay.
Right. And we could spend a very long time discussing what generally consistent is, or we could do the statute that was to do, which would be my suggestion.
Good discussion points. Keep going, Catherine.
All right, so very minor point. And this may also be something that would have to be changed by legislation. It says that a number of agencies will be supporting you in your work. It does not mention the Division of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, and I think Chris Campany suggested that maybe that, since they have a role in the overall, and you might want to speak to that, but that you might want to include them as a supporting entity in the state.
Yes, sorry, Joe and Erica, but even the fact that they're on the agenda tonight, I mean, it's for discussion. I mean, should they be included or not? And I'm not vested one way or another. It was just a question for the panel. Should they also be listed among those agencies? And I mean, I think it probably would require legislative change, I would guess.
Another point that came up when I was discussing a draft of this with the chair and the vice chair was whether or not there would be circumstances under which you would want to call an emergency meeting. And this probably also falls into that category of since there's no provisions for you to call a meeting where you haven't provided that 2-week notice, that would have to be something that would have to be specifically allowed for in a change in the legislation. But might be something you want to consider as you move into January, thinking about those proposals. Agendas. There's a couple points here about agendas, and that goes to how the agendas are set and how the agendas in advance, and then how the agendas might be changed in the meeting in the moment. A couple of considerations would be that first, the chair and the vice chair have the final decision or the final discretion in setting the agenda, but we probably want to put in a procedure and a timeline for soliciting input from the rest of the panelists on those agenda items, as well as potentially a timeline for the public to have a suggested agenda item. Ultimately, still, the final decision would be for the chair and the vice chair. Then there was a question, and I think this is something that was addressed, I think I pulled this from the Maine Yankee Citizen Advisory Panel. There was a situation there where they tried to address directly the possibility that an agenda item might come up at a meeting, and how do you deal with that? How do you decide when to take on new issues? In their charter, they said that there was a 2/3 vote required for approval, so more than a simple majority would be required in order to take on something that hadn't been pre-planned and people didn't have prior notice of. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think the law requires changes on the agenda to be the first order of business on the agenda.
Actually, that's true now under the new
law, and
that's true.
And I was at a recent VLCT presentation on this to towns, and they said if you're going to bring something new on the agenda, I mean, the question posed in that meeting was, well, you have to post the agenda ahead of time, and then your first order of business is to change the agenda. Thanks a lot if I didn't go to the meeting. And their advice was, you can go ahead and change it, but don't take action unless you're prepared to defend why you had to take action in that meeting.
Well, I guess that does raise a question about the allocation of your time then. So are you obligated in that situation to take on any new agenda item that is proposed?
Not at all.
So how do you decide? How do you decide whether or not you're going to take?
The chair says, no, we're not putting that on the agenda, or we're going to discuss it and we'll vote on it next time.
So then it would be not a 2/3 vote, but at the discretion of the chair.
I guess, I don't know.
Okay.
Good I mean, again, we're kind of getting the concepts out tonight. We're not planning on trying to resolve that, but that's a good point as well. So should I go back and ask if there are any changes to the agenda?
I'm going to jump to page 5. Because on page 5, I provided suggestion about how to handle media and communication that you might want to consider, not this specific language, but at least thinking about how you want to address this. Obviously, these meetings are public. They're videotaped. There's no secrets. So it's not an issue of whether or not information is going to be withheld in any way. This language really goes to address how decisions of the panel are represented in the public and how comments made by your fellow panelists are represented by you. So while you can speak for yourself and tell the media and anybody else in a public forum what you said, this suggests that you would not necessarily characterize, you would agree not to characterize the opinions or the statements of your fellow panelists in public forums or to the media.
No fun whatsoever, but okay.
And that's simply an effort to try to control mischaracterization, misinformation. It happens. So it's sort of out of respect for the fact that you will be spending a lot of time deliberating together over a lot of difficult issues, and and the record speaks for itself. And then I think when you talk about the positions of the panel as a whole, that is how you characterize them. And I'm going to talk about later sort of your obligation when you reach a decision. What is your obligation to support that decision in a public forum? Or do you have the opportunities for minority positions? All of those things I think are worth thinking about. I don't think we need to go over the specific language because we're not really there yet, but this is an idea that I think is worth talking about. One other factor that I put in a recent charter that is an issue that we know is going to get a lot of media attention, is to actually designate a point person for media. And it may be more than one point person, but you may want to consider, particularly on decisions, to have somebody designated who will be a spokesperson for the group as a whole. And you will probably spend some time drafting statements around that. The legislation is very clear about how you can vote to make decisions and how that voting should move forward. In the assessment report that I talked about last month, I made a recommendation that there's a lot of value to actually not voting on every item, but for issues that are of particularly key issues of significant importance, that you might want to strive to reach consensus. And I think there's a fair amount of language in the charter about this, in part because I think there's often the misperception that consensus means we go to the lowest common denominator, and that's, we have to compromise at that level in order to reach it. In fact, I think consensus has, if well structured in your process, trying to reach consensus actually, not only the end result has a lot of additional weight for your decision itself, compared to, say, a simple majority vote, but it also, I think, allows you, although it may take more time, to go through the process of understanding the differences in your positions, which is, here's where I stand, and get to the place where you actually start understanding what the underlying interests are and exploring where there might be some intersections between your interests where there doesn't appear to be any intersection between your positions. CBI, this is what we do. We try in many forums to help groups come to that type of consensus. And I will say up front that that does not mean that consensus is the right forum or the right decision-making tool for every decision. So that is not what I'm saying. But I think there might be some decisions where you would want, because of the importance, because of the impact, to try to spend more time in your deliberations to get there. So these bullet points are really sort of characteristics of the actual process that might be required to do that. I think at the bottom of, these are all on page 4. And I think the other aspect of this is that, when you have made an effort to reach consensus, the language proposed here says, you're running out of time, not making the progress you hope to make, so there is the discretion for the chair or the vice chair or some other form of decision making to say, okay, we need to move to a vote. And then finally, there are some questions about when you do vote. Clearly, there are going to be minority positions. There's going to be people that didn't agree. So are you going to allow, or do you want to explicitly allow in your charter the opportunity for minority positions to be stated in a report that the committee as a whole issues? There's strong reasons why you should, strong reasons why you might not want to, but again, something for you to consider and think about in the final charter. And this is really more a matter of taste. I put in here just a note that even though you're operating now under Robert's Rules of Order, that's not necessarily how you have to operate. We certainly have managed lots of deliberative groups that make decisions and move recommendations forward in a little less formal way, and often that's simply by allowing people to object. If they, so you sort of can take a sense of the room by finding out if there's an objection to a particular motion, explore that further. So, I just particularly don't find Robert's Rules of Order to be as helpful as they're intended sometimes in these particular types of forums. And I think that might be it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. There's one last section that I added that is, as you look at your charter, you'll see is highlighted in red to indicate that this is not part of the legislatively required aspects. And that is, how do you treat public comments? How do you manage your record as a matter of public record? What documents are considered public record and what are not? And what is your obligation to have public comment or public forums outside of your formal meetings? I think the tone has already been set that the public has a number of opportunities at these meetings to have comment. And as you get into more dense, I guess, deliberations over specific things and are trying to make decisions, you may need more time as a body to deliberate or to talk, to work through the issues, and there may be less time to take public comment. But I think you certainly may want to set a floor for the amount of public comment at a meeting. Here it says at least once, and more often at the discretion of the chair, and then allowing as a follow-up the opportunity for written comments at any time to the panel. And finally, the question then becomes, what is the obligation of the panel to respond to those comments, or not so much to respond personally to each comment as to show that you have how you have or have not considered those comments in your decisions. I think that's a part of transparency that helps the public understand, one, that their comment was heard, if not necessarily adopted, to understand why not. And then, there was a question about, I think I threw in, this was something that happened to also be, I thought it was a good idea, but then it raised a number of issues about the having as much communication as possible via email. In other words, sending out, instead of having to mail documents and send documents, to be able to transfer documents and have communication by email, for the public to be able to send comments by email. That then raises the question about public, whether that becomes part of the public record and how that gets handled. It seems that, I think I added the word that administrative emails are part of the public record. If a member of the panel gets an email from the public and responds to it, is there an obligation to put that into the public record because you're a member, or only if there is you're doing that in an official capacity on behalf of the whole panel? It gets a little messy, but I think it's something to consider because you don't want to get down the road and then trying to figure that out. And finally, I've provided a provision here that just says that you will undertake the obligation to have public engagement opportunities outside of these meetings. I think that would, these meetings are really designed primarily for you to be able to work together. And I think to the extent that you want to send a message to the public that you welcome their input and you want to provide them with something that is a much more robust opportunity rather than sort of this one-way conversation that trying to drop information into the middle of your work, that there might be, it might be worthwhile to have additional, to just commit to additional types of public engagement that particularly where there are fairly difficult technical issues that allow them the opportunity to get up to speed on some of those issues and to have some informed input along the way. So I think the next question that for you is how you want to proceed with this charter, and in terms of adopting it, thinking about the specific recommendations in there, and on what timeline. And I do think that this process of thinking through your charter is also a good foundation for you to think through some of the changes you might want to ask of the legislature come January.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Let me ask the panelists if there are any questions of Catherine at this point.
I have one. Just the thing about the additional opportunities for more information sharing and more dialogue sounds great. How do you do that? And with the public meeting restrictions that we have, how would those outside of these meetings? How would that take place?
Well, they wouldn't necessarily be formal. In other words, you wouldn't have to have a quorum of NDCAP members there. You would have to have representatives of the members there. And I think there would have to be some record keeping at that forum in order to gather information. And then that would come as an input to you as opposed to being an extension of your meetings.
Maybe like, you hold a public meeting on a particular issue or something, they advertise it. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I guess what I'd recommend at this point, and get the sense of the panel, but since this is the first kind of introduction to this concept that we've gotten, that we all kind of take this and over the course of the next several weeks think about things we agree with or don't agree with or changes we might suggest and send them to Catherine, and maybe you could do another draft for really a robust discussion at the next meeting if that was possible. Does that sound okay?
If she has funding left to do that.
Right.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes, please.
I think if we individually...
Speak louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think if we individually send them to Catherine and have her distill what everybody's saying, isn't that going to get confusing?
It will be, but less confusing than if you sent them to me. So.
Well, I'm just wondering if we need to speak about them together and get some consensus, and then not necessarily speak about them now.
Right.
But we're sending things to her to interpret what we mean. You know what I mean? I don't know which is more efficient.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. Yep, Chris?
Is it premature to suggest a small committee get together to start talking over some of the different attributes?
Not premature, but let me take a look and just see whether, if I ask for a show of hands of people who would want to be on that committee, if we get everybody raising their hands, or nobody raising their hands, that'll tell us something, but what are people's reaction to that? Do you think a small committee would make sense?
And I think this is something you can certainly do by phone. This is not a in-person meeting. This is just.
Well, if we had a committee, if we fed all the suggestions to Catherine and we had a committee who took all that, I mean, clearly I think there's going to be some suggestions that are similar, but if the committee then considered all of that and then boiled it down to the most salient points for their discussion and recommendation to us at the next meeting, that might be the most efficient way to go about it.
I think we probably need another month to decide whether we need a committee, but if we're going to have a committee, I want to be on it.
Okay. All right. Yes, Molly.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is just really more of a comment after reviewing the statute and the intent of the statute and looking at the draft and the charter. I think, first of all, I want to thank the state of Vermont and the legislators for including New Hampshire. I truly appreciate that. And it's really an honor to be here and to hear from all of you and to have the discussion and to work together because we are your neighbor and a very close neighbor. And I think what happens here will certainly affect the communities right across the river.
Absolutely.
But in saying that, when you look at the duties and then the roles that we play, and I think that when I read that or interpret that as this is an advisory committee, and so the advice goes to the governor's office in the end. And so I think I would just like to say that on this, so that my sense part of my role here would, in fact, I would also be communicating with the governor of New Hampshire, and just want that to be clear as well. And also when we talk about other public meetings or communication, just so it is known that I intend, and we have already talked and held our own public meetings in the state of New Hampshire as well, so that I would like to be able to bring that communication from my communities in New Hampshire and the citizens there as to how the decisions we're making here and what's happening on the decommissioning for the plant is affecting New Hampshire as well. So even though it's not specifically stated in the duties and it's not specific in the charter, I just wanted to make that clear so that that's transparent as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so why don't we think about? I'll ask for. Yeah, I'm going to do it. So why don't we establish a committee of people who are interested in working on this in the upcoming month, knowing that it will come back to us. And Mike, you're right, it might take another month after that to figure out what we're doing. And our report to the legislature is due in January when we make suggestions for any changes to the makeup of the committee or its duties. So we have time, but we're also learning to, what's the word, we are already walking and going down this road and need to establish the rules, if you will, as we go. So I appreciate, Catherine, that the idea behind here, we'll try and work on it, but who might, besides Mr. Toomey, who else might be interested in being on the committee? So we have Representative and Chris. Anyone else? Oh, and Jim. Yep, and Martin. Great. 5 sounds good.
Yep. Is that 4?
No, I had 5.
Jim, mine, Chris, Martin. Missed
Mike.
one? And Mike.
2 mics.
2 mics.
That's probably why you missed one.
Right. And I would be happy to help coordinate that and get it started by collecting the comments.
Yep, Chris.
I want to throw out that I don't know the answer to this, so this is not. I'm not trying to be provocative, but given the senator's comments, I mean, one of the things I think at some point, not only Vermont, but the 3 states and Entergy and everybody's going to want to figure out is, I mean, do you wind up having a decommissioning advisory panel in 3 different states? Is there one that functions perhaps differently than what the Vermont legislature initially had discussed? I don't know. But at some point, it's something that we probably want to talk about. I don't know that we could resolve it before the presentation to the legislature, but and I don't know that we've had decommissioning advisory panels in other decommissioning where you have multiple state jurisdictions and other issues. So I just throw that out there as food for thought. I'm not trying to throw a squirrel into the punch bowl here, but just something to keep in mind.
Well, I just want you to know, Senator Kelly, and also to Representative Mark, even though he's not here, I intend to run this to be fully open to any suggestions that you all have, and I fully expect you to do exactly what you said, which is hear your communities and bring those issues to us and bring the ideas that we have back to them. If we can be helpful in that process to you by coming to New Hampshire or something and doing something, we're happy to do that as well. But I think I want this to be as open as possible for you, so you feel that this can serve as a decommissioning panel for you rather than having to do this 3 times. But, that ultimately will be a decision of the other states.
Right, and just as well that the information in New Hampshire goes back to the governor of the state body as well, if in fact they look at any changes.
Sure, absolutely. So,
well, at the meeting in Hinsdale, I believe you were there. I don't know that any other of the panel members were there, but yeah, right. And so we've got some cross-pollination going on informally already.
Yeah, very
should.
Okay, so I was so proud that I was 15 minutes ahead, and now I'm 7 minutes behind. But so. Not on this one, thank you. And so if you all, as you all get to look at ideas or take a look at the charter, if you have ideas, please do send them in. Probably Tony is the best point of contact for those. But, we will try and incorporate those into the thinking of this, and we'll talk about it again. So thanks, Catherine, very much. I think that's a good start to get us thinking about this. So next on the agenda is really the bulk of this meeting, which is to hear about the site assessment report that Entergy has completed and given to all the panelists on the 15th or 16th of this month, and to understand it and discuss it. And there will be a public comment or question period for this one after we hear about it. So I'll turn it over to Entergy at this point. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mike Toomey on behalf of Entergy. This presentation reflects the work product of a lot of different people at Entergy. It was a big team of people who worked on this. Chris Wamser is here with me, particularly for the Q&A session to help be responsive to questions, and Barrett Green, who is our Vice President, and he is leading the project of the decommissioning effort. And Barrett, I've asked Barrett to come tonight to help us be able to respond to questions that we have that are beyond my ability to respond to. But I will start with an overview of the site assessment study.
Mike, would you mind just pulling the microphone maybe a little closer to you?
How's that?
I think that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's not picking up a lot.
Okay. We had a presentation at the last meeting that went into a fair amount of detail about the settlement agreement, and I'm not going to repeat the discussion about the whole settlement agreement, but there was a specific provision in the settlement agreement that is the genesis of the site assessment study. In the settlement agreement, we agreed that we would prepare a comprehensive study of the conditions of the site. And the real reason that the site assessment study got created was that in the course of trying to resolve various differences of opinion with the state over what the site restoration standard should be, it became apparent, I think, to both sides that it wouldn't be productive to try to have a conversation about what remediation work or what standards should be met for site restoration before we had done a comprehensive assessment of what work needed to be done. And so we essentially parked the issue of site restoration standards for negotiation at a later date, with the view that we would prepare the site assessment study first. The state and the public would have an opportunity to review the information, and then we could have a meaningful conversation about what site restoration standards should be. So in the agreement, what we said was we would prepare the site assessment study by the end of 2014. And we provided that actually, a couple of months early on October 17th, I believe. Is that the date? Yes. And the actual study is available on our website, vydecommissioning.com. It's all one word, no spaces. vydecommissioning.com. In hard copy, it looks like this. It's a little blue book it's about 60 pages long, and it's got a CD in the back with a number of materials available to it. I think we may have a few hard copies available tonight for people. I don't know how many we brought, but each of the panel members have one. What the site assessment study includes is a description of all of the existing radiological and non-radiological conditions at the site. So any condition that was created by the operation of the facility going back to 1972, including by the prior owners of the facility. We have comprehensive records of issues that happened. For example, an easy one that I use all the time about this issue is if some transformer oil spilled on a walkway at the site, if it was a sufficient volume, we would have had to report it, or the prior owners, if it happened before 2002, would have reported it, would have cleaned it up, remediated it, but we would have a record of the fact that that happened. That kind of information is what the site assessment study reflects. It's also a description of the decommissioning process. What will it take to take the transition of the plant from its current condition to being fully decommissioned? How do we intend to manage spent fuel over the course of the period? And of course, the most important item that I think most people were focused on is what is the cost estimate for doing all that work? And then we also attached a copy of the draft post-shutdown activities report. You'll hear it referred to as a PSDAR. That's a document that we have to file with the NRC. And what we agreed to in the settlement agreement with the state was that we would not file that document any earlier than 60 days after we gave the state the site assessment study. So what that allowed the state to do was review the material in the site assessment study, review a draft of the PSDAR, and provide us with comments on issues that they believe needed to be addressed differently than the way we had planned to address them, raise issues with us about information in the filing. And what we committed to do was to consider the comments that we received from the state before we made our filing. And so we're currently on target to file the PSDAR with the NRC by the end of the year. I think I skipped a page. Okay, so briefly, the site description and history. Construction permit was issued in December 1967. Plant began commercial operation in November 1972. We got a license extension from the NRC on March 21st. No, actually, I think we got it about 10 days earlier than that in 2011. I think we got it around March 10th, as I recall. We have wet and dry fuel spent storage. We talked about this a little bit at the last meeting. We're planning to move all of the fuel out of the spent fuel pool and into dry cask storage on our current schedule by the end of 2020. Then the spent fuel will be in dry cask canisters, and at that point we will wait, along with everyone else, for the Department of Energy to come pick up the spent fuel and dispose of it as the federal government is required to do. We, in reviewing the radioactive materials on site, we provided a historical site assessment that included known or potential contamination on site and non-radiological contaminants on site. I won't go through this in great detail. There's a very, I think, comprehensive discussion of this in the site assessment study. Great effort was made by many people, and I have to say, not me. I wasn't involved in that writing. They tried to make this as accessible to the average reader as we could possibly make it, given the technical nature of the information. We also discussed groundwater impacts and the groundwater monitoring programs that we have in place. And again, we talked about the spent nuclear fuel management. The biggest issue I haven't already talked about is the fact that we're going to be creating building a second independent spent fuel storage installation pad. You'll hear it referred to as the ISFISI pad. And that we need approval from the Public Service Board to build the second ISFISI pad. That filing for approval was made in June of this year. It's pending in front of the board, and we would expect a decision once we get this moving in 12 to 18 months. At this point, we don't see any delays in the Public Service Board proceeding that would impact our current schedule for completing the transfer to dry fuel storage. Radiological remediation was discussed in the study with exactly how it's going to work when we dismantle the facility, taking apart the reactor vessel and its internals, the systems and equipment, structures, the soil and foundations, and then the license termination process is what happens when we have completed radiological decommissioning to the satisfaction of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's not the end of the story. After that, there's site restoration for the facility. And we will have both federal and state guidelines that apply to that decommissioning effort. And we need to establish site restoration standards. It brings us back to the conversation I started with, which is we need to negotiate those with the state to determine if we can find constructive resolution and consensus as to what those standards will be. And I'll remind you that we discussed this a little bit at the last meeting. We've established a separate special fund for site restoration. We have always, since we bought the plant, had the obligation to do site restoration, but in an effort to address any concerns people would have about who's going to be here in 20 years, we created a separate trust fund. We deposited $10 million in that fund. This year, we'll deposit $5 million each of the next 3 years. So the fund will have at least an initial balance of $25 million with the expectation that it'll grow over time. It will not be the only source of completing site restoration, but it will be a substantial amount of money that should allay any concerns that people have or might have. We provided a decommissioning cost estimate, which is consistent with the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission's requirements for how you calculate those decommissioning cost estimates. What it came up with is we used the TLG, that's a company that provides the decommissioning cost estimates for us as well as for other companies around the country. This decommissioning cost estimate, and this is an important issue, it is submitted under the guidelines that are required by the NRC for the decommissioning cost estimate to be prepared. And it came up with $1.242 billion in 2014 dollars. Of that, the cost of doing the major dismantling and decontamination work and all of the work related to decommissioning is about $817 million. There was a media report earlier this week that suggested we were actually just transferring $817 million to the NRC for them to oversee us. That is not correct. What the $817 million is for us to do all of the work that the NRC requires us to do, except for spent fuel management, which is another big issue that the NRC requires us to do. Spent fuel management really is part of decommissioning. You can't decommission the facility without dealing with the spent fuel. So that's $368 million. And then the site restoration estimate we have is $57 million. The current balance in the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund was $642.6 million as of September 30th, 2014. Our funding approach, when you submit your PSDAR to the NRC, you have to tell them what work you're planning to do and how you're planning to pay for it. So we talk about it as a funding strategy. All it means is we have to explain to the NRC how it is that we plan to pay for the work that we have to complete. And that will be included in the PSDAR when we submit it. And we are looking at a number of different ways for addressing the funding. Is that it? One of the issues that we addressed in the site assessment study is that we are looking at a combination of funding for the spent fuel management work that has to be done over the next 5 years that could include withdrawals from the Decommissioning Trust Fund, as well as a line of credit, if you will, or another financing strategy that would allow us to have the cash flow to do the work for the ISFISI pad and the campaigns to move the spent fuel without having to invade the principle of the Decommissioning Trust Fund at this time. We're very confident we'll have adequate funding to do the work over the life of the project, irrespective of which way we approach it. But we wanted to be as transparent as we felt we could be at this point with how we plan to approach it. And so that if you have not read if you have an interest in this, which I assume you do by virtue of your attendance at this event tonight, I encourage you to read the site assessment study. It has a lot of information in it. It addresses many of the questions that I often hear from people about the project. But in addition to that, we're available to answer questions when it's appropriate under the agenda.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Well, let me start with asking the panelists if they have questions or comments, but I want to start first by saying I've read this, I've gotten through half of the CD. I will say the music wasn't as good as I was hoping it would be, but the information there is, I was actually very impressed with, particularly where my experience is in non-radiological issues, and I thought those were covered very well. But I do notice that, it is an assessment of historical conditions and documents that are available. At some point, having some experience with other industrial sites, not radiological in nature, but as you start doing work, you're going to find other stuff, or how do you assess is probably a better way to ask the question. And at what point do you assess things that might not be known right now, but how do you find them, and how do you assess them, and then how do you deal with them, and where in the process is that supposed to occur?
Well, I'm going to ask either Chris or Barrett to chime in, but I think what you've raised is an excellent point. There are limits to how much we can provide in terms of information here until we start some of the, what we'll describe as the intrusive work, putting a hole in a wall to determine exactly what that is made out of is not something that we would do while the plant is running. So there are several layers of additional sort of hands-on intrusive evaluation of the conditions of the site that cannot begin until the facility stops operating, but will be done once that happens. And either Chris or Barrett, I don't know how much detail we have at this point, but
I think to address your question just generally is, how do we do business now, right? So currently we have protocols and surveillances and things like that that are done on site all the time. So some of the information that's provided in the site assessment study was previously developed through our normal monitoring process. I mean, obviously there's a lot there that's in a record book, so to speak. But we have processes to do monitoring, to do surveillances and whatnot. Probably the best, near-term analogy is we're not going to get into what I would consider significant decommissioning, i.e. removing reactor vessel and things like that in the near term, but what we will get into in the next year to two would be taking down some smaller outbuildings and things like that. Our normal process for that would be when the building is disassembled and removed, to do surveys of conditions that are found there and to document those conditions. So I would say that we will have real-time updates of information as conditions present themselves that we would retain in records just like we do now, and that would add to the collective knowledge of what the site status is on a day-to-day basis sometime in the future when we get into more significant decommissioning activities. We're going to have a more detailed, investigative and survey protocol that we're going to have to establish at that time.
The other panel? Yes, sure.
When are you going to start laying off employees? I don't remember the date that you're going to start cutting your employees.
Well, that's it's a broad question. We have had reductions in staffing levels over the course of the last several months through a combination of factors. Some resulting from retirements, some resulting from people looking for other jobs with other companies because they understand that the operations of this facility are going to terminate. We've had placement of other employees at other facilities that we own. We will have a big staffing reduction within the month of January in connection with the defueling of the reactor. And so you'll see a step down. We talked about that a little bit at the last meeting. I think we go down to 316 off of the current number, which I think is about 550. Is that right?
Right.
So we'll go down to 316 on sometime in January of 2015, and then we will have another step down in on or about April of 2016. And I believe that number is about 127.
Right.
So we'll go down to about 127, and each of those step down changes reflects a change in the operational characteristic, or certainly after December it's not operational, but in the industrial characteristic of the facility that we're dealing with and what is required. For example, there'll be a full platoon of security that needs to be retained long after the facility is no longer operating and no longer containing spent fuel. We still have to have security guards, for example, to guard the dry cask storage as well as other security protocols. But those are the big step downs that we've described. I don't think is there another level that we've identified? Is it after 2020?
After 2020, and that number is very rough, right? The current estimate after 2020 time period, presuming we hit the schedule we were talking about to get the dry fuel into casks, is we're looking at a head count of around 60 or so at that point in time. But that's pretty far out there at this point.
The reason I raised it was because when you lay off employees, you're losing some institutional memory of people who've worked there who might know where there may be spills or things that are not written down. And I want to make sure that can be accounted for.
That's a great point. So a couple of different things. Just on the people side of the house, we're working very hard to make as soft a landing as possible for everybody. And I'll say we've had great success in finding other opportunities for people that want to continue to work for our company and stay in the industry. And I spoke over in the state of New Hampshire with Senator Kelly last week in a little bit more detail on that. Regarding your last comment, though, about institutional knowledge, there's two pieces. So just from a pure aspect of change management, we have essentially every department, not essentially, we have every department on site doing extensive change management plans to go from where we are to future state. Some of that is, much of that is business processes and things like that, but it also does get down to the individual specialist in a lot of departments. What is it that person does, and what are they going to stop doing, or who's going to pick up what they're doing? So we're working through that level of process. Related to your point about your knowledge of site conditions, that is something that is done in developing the surveys that are referred to in the site assessment study and are actually part of the attachments. If you read those closely, you'll see that a number of sources of information were used to obtain the information, and included in that was interviews. And I think to pull this assessment together, there was an outreach to go find retired individuals, people that are not even currently on our site today, that they went backwards and went out and found people that worked here during construction times or early operations.
I just want to make sure I have the timing right of the PSDAR filing. I believe you said that would happen within 60 days of the release of the site assessment?
No, what we committed to do was not to file the PSDAR any sooner than 60 days after we submitted this. So to give the state a full 60-day period in order to read this and evaluate it, we are currently targeting to file the PSDAR by the end of the year. So do the math. Sometime between the middle of December and the end of December would be consistent with our obligation not to do it less than 60 days afterwards but we're expecting to do it before the end of the year.
The reason that I ask is that I believe that at least some discussion about whether or not we have, if you will, all of the studies and all of the probing that we would like to have done is an appropriate topic for this panel. And given the amount of information and the fact that virtually all of us here are volunteers in terms of doing this, in addition to what it is we do, 60 days is, I don't think, enough time, but that's my personal opinion. And having gone through this, there are some probing things that I would like to get at, but next question, if you will. There is discussion in this and in one of the appendices about the suit against the Department of Energy, since they have not, in fact, taken responsibility for spent fuel. What I could not find, and it may be I just haven't studied on it enough, is the relationship of the potential for revenues gained under that impacting the full bottom line of the slide that you had earlier with that $368 million for spent fuel management. So I couldn't find or understand, but it may be there, I may have missed it, or understand what the relationship is between that potential source of money and that liability.
There's probably more than two ways to look at it, but there are at least two ways to look at it. One is if we take the money out of the fund to address spent fuel management costs that we incur after we shut the facility down.
This is the $600 million decommissioning fund.
Correct. Correct. And let me back up by saying the litigation that we've had to date has been on past costs that we incurred while the plant was operating. And so that's separate. That just money was spent by Entergy out of its own pocket to pay for spent fuel management. That money relating to activities up until December of 2014 or whatever the date is for the operational cutoff, that's independent of your question. For spent fuel management costs that we incur in the decommissioning phase of the facility, there's really a couple of ways we can handle it. If we go into the fund, let's say it's $100 million. We go into the fund to take $100 million out to pay for $100 million of costs that we incurred that's related directly to spent fuel management. We have a specific provision in the settlement agreement that requires us, if and when we get the recoveries from the DOE for that money, that it go back into a trust fund that is specifically designated for VY decommissioning work. So if it comes out of the fund, it goes back into a trust fund specific for VY. The other way we may address it, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, is we may decide to set up a separate line of credit where we don't touch the fund, we just have a borrowing facility and spend the money out of that, borrow money from the bank, pay for the costs, and then when that money would come back from the DOE, that money would go back to pay the bank. So it wouldn't go into the trust fund because it didn't come out of the trust fund. So it's a long way of answering your question, which is if it comes out of the fund, it goes back into a trust fund that's specifically earmarked for Vermont Yankee, and that's, I can't remember what provision that is in the settlement agreement. It's either 11 or 12. It consumed the better part of a week of conversation, the better part of a week of conversation among the lawyers to get the language exactly right. If, of course, the money doesn't come out of the fund, then it doesn't relate to the fund. So
I think David's question might be, let me try it, and I want to come back to the schedule issue in a minute, but on this particular one, I got the sense David was asking. So that is part of the the cost of obviously moving the fuel out of the pool is a step in decommissioning, if you will, even though it's spent fuel management.
Correct.
It's part of the $1.24 billion. Correct.
Correct.
But if you spent 368 million on spent fuel management, that means that the remaining cost of doing the work is about the 817 plus the 57 for site restoration. And if it didn't come out of the fund, right, and your fund is 600 million, 640 now, and you didn't take that out of the fund, or it got returned to the fund, either way, as long as it was relatively quick, then your remaining work to be done is the 817 plus the site restoration. And frankly, the NRC doesn't really care about the site restoration piece. So 817 is the trigger point for what the fund needs to grow to get to that point.
Well, I'm going to let Barrett elaborate on this, but the spent fuel management costs are not a lump sum of dollars that we will spend in the short term. There are going to be ongoing costs for spent fuel management for decades.
Good point.
And so that you will not, under any scenario that I can think of, unless the DOE were to come pick up the fuel prior to us completing decommissioning, you're not going to have the condition that you've posited. Because we have to pay for security, maintenance, and there are other costs. But Barrett may want to elaborate on that answer. But I think there are ongoing spent fuel management costs that are part of the 368 million.
Sure, but clearly the bulk of them are related to the ISFA pad and the moving and the buying of the dry cask and moving of the fuel into that, I would assume.
I do have a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
Previous expenditure.
Okay.
Okay, so as Mike said, it's not as simple as looking at the 640 million and when that grows to 800 that we would be able to move forward. Right? In developing the estimate, we made assumptions about a number of things that would occur, including how the DOE would behave in the future. If that's different, then the estimate has to change to account for that. The way the NRC looks at this, and in a sense, the whole reason that we have these different categories is because the NRC regulations that create the requirement for us to have this sinking fund. Okay. The original regulation was created in '83, I believe, which dealt with decommissioning a plant, assuming the DOE picked up the fuel, because that was the assumption at the time. When it became apparent that that was not going to be a good assumption, the NRC created another regulation. They did not go back and amend the original regulation. They created a new one that got put in a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's what gives us the distinction, okay, which is very confusing, between this license termination category and the spent fuel management category. And it's not even particularly well defined in their world as to exactly how you draw the distinction between those two.
All right, that's probably enough for me for now, but David, go ahead.
The money that VY has spent in terms of spent fuel management, what effect did those expenditures have on the amount that was contributed to the decommissioning fund?
Well, from the time period that we owned the plant, none. Because the fund was established and came along with the plant when we bought the plant. And the expectation at the time when we bought the plant in 2002 was that the fund would grow. And quite frankly, this is an issue we probably don't need to spend time on. The original expectation was that we were going to operate till 2032, and the fund would have that much time to grow. That was an assumption that is reflected in the Public Service Board order, and as far as I can tell, the expectation of all the parties who participated in that case. But the short answer is there have been no funds put into the Decommissioning Trust Fund between 2002 and now. What we have done on the issue of spent fuel management is for costs that we incurred between 2002 and 2015, we've sued the DOE for part of those. There are some of the most recent costs that we haven't yet sued them for. But there is a batch, there was a batch that we received a judgment on in early 12 or late 2011 of about 45 million or so. That reflected dollars that we had spent. We had not taken that out of a trust fund. We had not collected that from ratepayers because we were a merchant facility. It was money that just Entergy Nuclear Vermont Yankee spent as it spends on any other material or supply. But at least for this category of cost, the federal law allowed us to recover that from the DOE because those are costs that we should not have had to incur. And we only incurred them because the Department of Energy breached its contract. It would be the same as if we had spent money with a vendor who was selling us equipment and the equipment was faulty and we had to buy new equipment and we sued the original vendor for not fulfilling his contract. We would have spent the money first with the first vendor, then with the second vendor. We'd be out double. We'd sue the first vendor presumably and get our money back because he breached his contract. I think that might be a way to think about the DOE. We've had to spend money at the plant that we shouldn't have had to spend because the government breached its contract with us. And that's the money we got back, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the original decommissioning trust fund. It's relevant in the future because as we become a decommissioned facility, we're going to continue to incur spent fuel management costs. And the only way to pay for that spent fuel management, which as the commissioner pointed out, is part of decommissioning. It's part of the process of decommissioning the plant is dealing with the spent fuel, just like dealing with the buildings and dealing with the other equipment that's on site that has to be disposed of. Spent fuel is just another part of decommissioning. But for that category, we have the ability to sue the federal government because we shouldn't have had to incur those costs. And we wouldn't have incurred those costs if they hadn't breached their contract. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but that's the way I look at it.
So, let me go here first.
So the two approaches that you outline, one is dipping into the decommissioning fund, the other one is having a line of credit. If you do a line of credit, would you, and then you sue the government, as you explained, would you expect to recover also the interest cost that you incurred?
Well, let me correct one thing. I probably set it up poorly. It's not really an entire either or. It's really a combination. There'll be some costs that we'll take out of the fund and some that we'll take out of the line of credit. We're really trying to focus on the line of credit for the early expensive stuff. And the answer to your real question was, if we were suing anybody other than the United States of America, we would collect interest, but we are not allowed to collect interest because the government has given itself insulation from that kind of recovery by private parties.
All right, so the issue of where the interest gets paid is an open question, but
well, it's not. We just, that's a cost that we incur,
right,
and that we don't recover.
Okay. Well, I just want to make the point that out of those, between those two approaches, and I realize it might be a combination, that the line of credit would be very much preferable because I think the bigger issue is that the more that you take out of the decommissioning fund, the less it's going to grow. Nobody is going to reimburse that fund for the lost capital gains and dividends and whatnot that it might have gained over that time. So, dipping into that really postpones the time significantly when it would be sufficient to do the decommissioning.
Well, you've certainly identified that that's a major issue. Unfortunately, I mean, the Decommissioning Trust Fund has always been the source, the expected source of the spent fuel management costs, along with the rest of the decommissioning work. We are trying to ameliorate the effect of that by creating this line of credit. Now, remember, we're setting up a line of credit by a company, well, by a plant, really. It's not generating any revenue. And so there are limits to what, when you don't have any revenue, the bank will loan you. Now, we do have other corporate support for this to some extent, and we are exploring that, but we are trying to find the right balance between financial stewardship of the trust fund and working through the process that we have to work through at the site. And I think we're gonna try to find that balance. And when I talked to Commissioner Recchia to advise him that we were exploring the idea of a line of credit, I think that was relatively welcome news from the state, because we could just take it all out of the decommissioning trust fund. We're trying to find a way to make that impact less.
And the other point I think is important is we've also been talking with the Department of Energy and the Department of Justice in a constructive way to see if there's a way to speed this process up, because it does matter. It does matter if you take $100 million out of the fund and you don't get it back for 10 years. That's very different than taking 20 million out and getting that 20 million back in 6 to 8 months and reusing that piece as you go along, right? You can picture that, but I definitely want to agree that, I do appreciate the thinking about a line of credit, because we're all worried about the speed at which this fund can grow. And, it's been doing very well in the last, in the 18 months that I've been commissioner. When I started, it was $518 million, and now it's $642 million. I would like someone to invest my meager little 401k in the same way, because whatever it is working. Granted, it's been a historic year for the stock market and whatever investments it's in, but I can picture within the time frame that we are looking at, and there are conservative assessments of this and then optimistic ones, and I put myself in the optimistic camp of thinking, gee, I could picture that, if this fund continues to grow at the rate it's been growing, that shortly after the spent fuel is out of the pool and into dry cask, you can start seriously thinking about when you can start dealing with this plant. But that's down the road a little bit. I wanted to go back a little and address the timing issues that Representative Dean had on the site assessment and our review of that, and how it feeds into the PSDAR. Because I think that, so I'll put this little seed in our collective heads. My hope would be that next month's meeting could really focus on the site assessment. Like, we have a month to review it. We come in and we really discuss our comments and suggestions on the site assessment. Including the appendices, which includes the PSDAR draft in Appendix C. Also, at next month's meeting, be able to gain comments from the public that are more informed after you all have a chance to review this, and that we collectively work to define our comments in that time period and decide then whether we need more time or not. The state is doing the same thing. The state agencies are reviewing this in this context and intend to try and have comments to Entergy by November 30th, ideally informed by this group that would help put it all together in one piece. But I think an important piece to remember is that even if the PSDAR gets submitted, and our comments are incomplete or not quite done, or we had comments on the site assessment but not the PSDAR, the PSDR does require a public comment period by NRC, and this panel will have an opportunity to weigh into that again when that occurs. And I would expect that in the February 2015 timeframe. So there's still time to really, I think, influence that, both as this panel with Entergy before it's submitted, and then again after it's released by the NRC. Chris.
So first, I just want to say, the line of credit, anything you guys can do on that front, we've been hopeful, as you know, one regional commission has been hopeful that the spent fuel management could be used, that funding for that could be come from some source other than the decommissioning fund. So anything you can do to help because of the reinvestment issue. So it's great to hear that you guys are even thinking about it. And I don't know, maybe if LSU beats Alabama this weekend, they'll be so thrilled that you'll get more corporate support too. And I would love that as an LSU
I'll
grad.
take the election.
I'd like to see that happen myself. But anyway.
For instance, 401k, they'll take that in.
Yeah, I will actually. It actually made the difference.
So to me, that's the headline of the night so far that you guys are even talking about it. So it's very much appreciated. I just have a process question, Chris, so in the settlement agreement, it says Entergy VY shall review the results of the study with PSD, ANR, VDH, and shall consider any comments provided by those parties for inclusion in the PSD, AR, et cetera. So it actually sounds like, well, hopefully Entergy would take into account the comments from the panel. But frankly, it sounds like the agencies should be receptive of public comment for your experts within your departments to process and review. So really, it seems like for the public, for the panel members and others, if you have comments in the interim, even before November, they need to start getting those to the agencies, because really it's the agencies that are getting comments to Entergy. It's not, they're not, and again, I'm not saying you wouldn't take the comments from the public, but under the agreement, it's coming from the three agencies.
No, in fact, I have to say, we would strongly prefer that it come through the agencies, because just as a matter of process, it would be very difficult to keep track of comments that came in by email to various people at the site. Please pass this along to Chris Wanzer. We'd like him to consider this. So I do think we were very deliberate about setting up the process. We do believe that the right way to do it is if you have comments to feed those through the agencies. Certainly, this panel was created after we signed the settlement agreement. If the panel has comments and we receive those, by the end of November, so really we need them by the end of November so that we can look at them, then we can take them, we can review them. We are going to file the PSDAR by the end of the year. And so whatever comments are filed or submitted through those agencies or at the panel, we can feed that to the team that is finalizing the PSDAR and are happy to do that.
There's nothing in my remarks that meant that the panel was going to submit individual comments from the panel. We have the agency's name sitting at the table.
Yeah, I would hope that I, for one, and I know Agency Natural Resources, and I assume the Department of Health as well, we want the panel's input to us, in addition to obviously Entergy sitting there as well, so that we can incorporate those comments into our thinking and our comments.
So the follow-up then is the state agencies probably should set a date by which you want comments. And you may not want to wait as late as November 20th.
Maybe.
If your comments are actually going to be processed, analyzed, come to a report so they can actually do something with it, because that's...
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the fact that that this panel's scheduled to meet November 20th. That's really the next opportunity to fully digest it. I think there's time between November 20th and November 30th, minus one evening of sleeping after eating the turkey, to do
a lot of football.
To do this work. I'm not going to do the football part. I'll skip that part. So I think there's an opportunity, but I think that if we get there and we find we need an extra week or something, I could picture requesting that and doing that. But our current target is to, and we have an interagency meeting with more than just the agencies that are mentioned in there. We meet regularly, and we're shooting for reviewing this, commenting on it, thoroughly discussing it internally, and trying to have comments by the 30th, just to try and stay on track here.
Yeah, just for A&R, we certainly welcome the panel's comments. We are feverishly working on this right now. It is a complicated, thorough document with a lot of information. We have in the Department of Environmental Conservation, a whole waste management division with experts in site assessment for facilities focusing on non-radiological issues. So we are doing our work right now and doing it hard. And I would imagine by the next meeting, Commissioner Mears, I'm sure he'd bring someone from that division, talk to them perhaps, but, so yeah, I mean, as soon as you have comments, you don't have to have a formal date. I mean, you review it and something strikes you, please, you can send it through Commissioner Mears, will get it to the right people who need to get the comment.
I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is just by when do you guys, from a very practical standpoint, by when does it actually have impact or meaning or can even be processed because of your state?
Well, I mean, the sooner the better. I mean, we're still processing it ourselves right now. Right. I mean, it's, there's a lot in there. So, I mean, if you're able to go through it and you've got something strikes you that you think should be addressed, let us know as soon as you can.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm assuming that if questions are coming through state agencies, you would accept questions as well from the agencies in New Hampshire, Homeland Security or whatever, or
just
from
consider
myself.
yourselves, for the purposes of these meetings, but don't mention this when you go back across the board, just consider yourselves part of Vermont.
Well, and one thing.
And I just had a follow-up on that, and I hope I've got this right, and I really, truly appreciate I think it is on the second page here, the acronyms. Here, this is great. But I think you're saying that PSDAR, and you're saying that you need that report by the end of the year. Is that because you decide, Entergy, or is that coming from the NRC, or what determined that that's the date at the end of this year? Because we're backing into that.
Right. We established the timing for that. There is an outer limit that we must submit it by, which is pretty far in the future. I think we are required to submit it within 2 years of cessation of operations.
Required by
the NRC within 2 years, but we have an internal deadline and we're planning to file it. And maybe one thing to think about as you consider comments, what we are going to submit is a report, this PSDAR, that is prescribed by the NRC in large part in terms of what it contains, how you have to present the material, etc. And there's a draft of that document in the appendices. That is the document that would be the most important for people to look at to see if they have comments about that. There's no deadline for commenting to the panel or anybody at an agency about the rest of what's in the site assessment study, because that's not, what we're filing is we're filing the PSDAR. It's the draft PSDAR that people should look at, and there are a lot of material. For example, you're talking about the non-radiological. I don't believe the PSDAR addresses the non-radiological information at all. So there would be no clock ticking, so to speak, on providing comments about the non-radiological, because that's not even going to be addressed in the PSDAR. So I would direct people's attention in the, we don't have a paper copy in this document, but it's Exhibit C. So it's on the CD that is attached. It's appendices number letter C. That's the draft PSDAR. That's the final version of which will be submitted by the end of the year. I believe on the website, the appendices are also available to look at by going to the website and accessing the site assessment study and then looking for appendix letter C.
So what are people's reaction to the idea of really taking the bulk of next month's meeting to really be prepared to have a thorough discussion with Entergy on this document? Does that sound okay? Yes.
Well, given the timeline on the PSDAR, should that be the majority of the discussion versus the balance of the study, the assessment?
Sure. I mean, I think that the PSDAR is what's being submitted, and we will have another opportunity to review that or to comment to NRC on that. So I'm kind of torn because, truthfully, I look at the site assessment as the guiding document for the PSDAR. So I have mixed feelings about that, and I think just scheduling a time to really thoroughly review it, we'll see where it goes. But in the event that there were outstanding issues on the PSDAR, or we just couldn't get everything done, I know that we have another opportunity on that.
That's the public comment period with the NRC.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
That sounds great to have that be the majority of the time for the next meeting. Personally, I would benefit a lot from knowing what people's questions and concerns were, because there's a lot of material in here that's way beyond my education. Is there a way for us to get that information to each other without violating the open meeting law?
Right.
Send them in maybe to you guys and you send out a summary or something?
Yeah, truthfully, we're still reviewing that. But I mean, I will say, just so everybody's really clear, any emails that come in to or among the panelists are public records. So that's not the issue. The question is whether we are triggering a actual meeting by all talking together as a panel, and I think we are. But so I don't know how yet to handle that. We're still reviewing that.
If there's any way to get that information from everyone else, to at least think about it before the next meeting, I think it would help a lot.
Could there be on some kind of, when we update our regional plan, we have to create our own website and people could post questions. And would that be a possible option? I mean, even for anybody, frankly, to post questions about, then everybody sees it. I mean, whether it's the panel or not.
Yeah. Yep, we could do that so you get a sense of issues that people are identifying.
Then anyone in the public.
Yep, and you guys can do the same.
I mean, Entergy sees it. I mean, everybody sees it.
Both questions and comments.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Right.
Post on this, on the website.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can set that up. We do have a website.
Well, wait, does that make sense? I mean, is there agreement on that, or is that
I
a
don't know.
really bad idea that we're about to have?
Probably the easiest way.
Tony thinks it's a bad idea, but he doesn't get to.
More work.
Does anyone have an objection or comment on that or suggestion?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it can.
That avoids a lot of the public meeting problem.
Okay.
It's just an open site.
All right, we will try that. We'll try to set that up quickly. So what I'd like to do now, knowing that this is going to be discussed again next month, but I would like to give the public a chance to comment or ask questions that they might have on this. I don't know if we'll be able to answer all the questions that you have, but we will take them. So anyone want to comment? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to know what precautions you're taking to prevent drones flying over the spent fuel rods or the reactor.
All right, would you mind telling us your name, please?
Frances Crowe, CROWE.
Well, I am sure that this is a very unsatisfying response, but the bottom line is we have a very comprehensive security system in place that we don't talk about publicly. It's a matter of very sensitive information that is shared only with the NRC and even in not within the company with people who do not have security clearance, including me.
Thank you. Let me see if there's any other questions before I come back. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Deb Katz. I have some questions about the cost for the spent fuel management. If you could break it down a little, because I'm a little confused. I mean, I was involved in the Yankee Road decommissioning, in the working on that as part of an advisory panel, as well as the Connecticut Yankee decommissioning. When you talk about, I think it's 360 or 358 million, is that how much will it cost to move the fuel and dry casket? Is the amount that 300 and some odd million, does that include also basically babysitting it for a number of years? At Yankee Row, it's about $5 million a year to continue to watch over the fuel. So I'm just trying to get a breakdown on what the actual numbers are in that.
So within the appendix that has the decommissioning cost study on it, there is a more detailed breakdown within that, but loosely, about $175 million to run the dry fuel program. So to put the new incremental concrete pad down, okay, that is the subject of the CPG proceeding now, to procure the casks, to procure the loading services of the casks, and to physically move them from the spent fuel pool to the pad and set them up with the monitoring system on the pad.
So that's 107. So when you're talking about that larger number, are you then talking about the oversight you're going to have to do every year?
Correct. The bulk of the rest of that number is the spending that runs through, in the assumption in here, 2053, okay, which is the assumption about when the DOE would pick up the last of the fuel from the site.
So that actually what you need to come up with is 175 million at this point, not 358 million. Because much of that is going forward costs in terms of overseeing the site. You're talking about 175 million, you have to come up with part of it coming from the decommissioning fund and part of it potentially from a line of credit.
Well, even today, we're spending money on spent fuel management, maintaining the pool and maintaining the casks that are already on the pad.
Right.
Okay, so that's the stream of spending for just operating the pad and operating the pool. That starts immediately.
Right.
Right.
So is that about 5 million a year?
I'd have to look at what it is.
6.
Okay.
6 million. Okay. But I just wanted to try to break that down in terms of the chunk of money you really needed to come up with, because $350 some odd million sounds a lot more and taking most of the decommissioning fund. But in fact, you're not talking about taking that much at all. You're talking about a much smaller amount in terms of it.
Well,
175 million plus the going forward each year with it.
we are talking about this credit facility being a number in the $150 million range.
Right. No, that I understand.
That's plenty challenging enough for this entity to get that support.
I understand, but it's a little less challenging than.
I agree that it's less challenging than 368, but
for all of us in terms of it. So, and do you need, I know at Yankee Row and at Connecticut Yankee, the decommissioning fund was never conceived of as paying for, in fact, dealing with the fuel on site. Those were separate costs in terms of those decommissionings. Do you need to get special permission from the NRC to actually take the money out of that fund to use some of it for dry cask storage?
it's called a commingled fund exemption, and we do expect to get it from the NRC.
But you're applying for that.
We will be applying for it, and that's something that we will apply for after the filing of the cost estimate and the PSDAR, because I have to reference those documents in the commingled fund filing. Right. So, but to be sure we're clear on how people should think about this. Okay. When Entergy bought the plant in 2002, the MOU and the order authorizing the sale make clear that we intend to use the trust fund for spent fuel management. So that was an assumption from the beginning for Entergy. I understand people may have different views on how they interpret that. Regardless of what the historical collection of that fund may have been, when it passed to Entergy, and Entergy assumed the liability to manage this, to manage the liability, That was the assumption under which it passed to Entergy.
I understand that. Citizens Awareness Network was involved in that proceeding. We did have a different perception about it, but at this point, I would be happy for you to get the fuel out of the pool. So I'm not going to argue about that. I have one other question, which is about the DOE and the money that you would get back in suing them. And my understanding is that what you get back is about 80%, that you don't get 100% back in terms of it. And I just would like clarification of whether that's true or not, or about how much you would expect back.
All right, so the proceeding with the DOE is that it's a contractual dispute between two parties. And Entergy, as the aggrieved party, has to meet a standard of proof in a theoretical world where DOE was performing of, I spent money on building this pad, and DOE had been performing, I would never have had to do that. Therefore, I should get all of that money back. Right. In collecting up all of the cost that Entergy sues DOE for, we collected up in our view of what the costs were, which might include, does include, the overhead of Chris Wamser to watch the building of the pad. Okay. Because we are in litigation with the DOE, a long litany of experts from both sides go into technical arguments about whether the right amount of money was allocated out of Chris Wamser's salary to that, or out of Barrett Green's salary to that, or out of how much of security was inconvenienced and had to run special shifts because of. So the first iteration, we have a number of things that we put in and tried to establish that we thought we should have gotten, right? And some of which were disallowed by the court. Okay? And notwithstanding the fact that we can't do it, we still asked for the cost of money too, and got that disallowed. We produce a long list of these things like crane upgrades and that sort of thing that ended up being a dual purpose thing. Okay, that since we had it, we used it for something else, and then the government said, well, since you used it for something else, it shouldn't have counted against us. We have used the assumption in the document we provided here of a 90% recovery rate. We are highly confident that once we get into the shutdown period and things that are much more clearly happening because the DOE is not picking up the fuel, that we're going to achieve that rate or better. All right. So
thanks, Chris. I think I'm going to keep moving if that's okay. Thank you, Deb. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Nancy Brown, and I want to ask you a question that has been, especially with the safe store option on the table, and it sounds like 2050 is the time that I've read, that 2053, which is 40 years from now, and many corporations that existed 40 years ago do not exist today. Many corporations that existed 40 years ago don't exist today. Is there a provision for if Entergy is not in the picture in 2053, who is going to pay for decommissioning at that point if this fund has not appreciated to the point where it's $1.2 billion in 2014 dollars, which who knows what it's going to be in 2053 dollars. It's definitely a moving target. So I'm just curious, what's the provision? I've asked various people and nobody seems to have an answer to that.
Well, I think the easiest answer, first of all, I think the 2053 is sort of the worst case scenario. When we submit the decommissioning PSDAR, we're required to assume a couple of things. First of all, we're required to assume that we're going to take spent fuel management money out of the fund and not get recovery at all from the DOE. They're very conservative about that. In fact, we have recovered more than 90%, and we expect to recover that or better, as Barrett just pointed out. It also requires us to assume a pretty conservative growth rate for the fund, and certainly less than we've seen over the last 5 years, and less than we've seen, in fact, since we took over the plant. So under those, and we talk about this a little bit in the site assessment study, if you just correct the assumption about the DOE recovery, you're in the 2040s. If you correct the assumption about the growth rate, and you choose a number that is consistent with our historical experience, of course, we can't guarantee future performance, but if you choose a number that's consistent with what we've seen over the last, I guess it's almost 13 years, about 12 years, you can get into the 2030s. So I think just as a fundamental point, I wanted to point out we don't really think we'll have to go to 2053. We're very hopeful that we'll be able to do it much sooner than that. But the Decommissioning Trust Fund really is the primary source of protection against the question that you have, which is why the decommissioning trust funds have been so carefully created and rigorously evaluated by the NRC over the years, including things like those conservative assumptions that I mentioned. So the Decommissioning Trust Fund continuing to grow is the primary source of that. There are any number of different legal questions that could be raised if the worst case scenario happened. Honestly, my experience, and I've been a lawyer, is that for me to describe them today on camera of exactly what could and could not happen could very well prejudice the company's ability to get recovery from some other party 20 years from now, and I'd rather not do that. I'd rather not be Exhibit A. In the proceeding, that Vice President Mr. Toomey said that this was the only way for this to happen, and so therefore the cases win. So there are a number of different scenarios. I think that the NRC has got primary responsibility for this issue. They're confident that the Decommissioning Trust Fund is the right way to go. There are other legal proceedings that could be brought to bear. There are a number of other provisions of federal law. I hesitate to list them here for lack of clarity in the future.
And I think it would be prudent for me to say at this point on camera that the state of Vermont does not necessarily agree with the interpretation that this is where this should come from, but we're trying to work constructively through this and appreciate the concept that even a line of credit might be on the table to talk about. So, other questions? Let's do another question and then we'll move on. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Leslie Sullivan Sachs.
Sorry, could you say that again because the train?
Sure. Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Leslie Sullivan Sachs.
Thank you, Leslie.
The dry casks, has that issue been decided what dry casks will be purchased? Or will there be a period of time when the panel has an opportunity to hear about different vendors who might have different products available?
So we have not entered a contract to buy the remaining dry casks that are necessary. That the process of contracting with the very limited number of vendors who provide that sort of product is, that's a contractual matter within the company. I don't expect that we would seek input from the group here on whether we should choose Holtec or NAC for the casks.
I'll just point out that there is a similar panel looking at decommissioning issues at San Onofre, and that panel did have an opportunity to hear from different vendors.
Yeah. Well, the fact that Entergy might not be seeking our advice on this doesn't mean that we won't necessarily talk about it and talk about the technologies and the differences, because I think the panel would probably want to understand that.
Well, I can tell you for certain that the two vendors would love to come here and spend all night explaining why they are the preferred They would even be happy to take you out to dinner.
That won't be happening.
And, but we are deeply involved in discussions with the vendors who could provide this product and this service. We're limited to the people who the NRC has licensed to provide casks for spent fuel storage, which is basically just the vendor we use now, which is Holtec, and their main competitor, which is NAC. And there are a number of factors that will end up dictating whether the NAC system can even work on the VY site.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, Chris, very briefly, to address just that last point, and this will probably be something we talk about in the governance committee, but I just think it's important to remember that, the legislation that created this panel was very specific, that the panel is not in a position to direct the decommissioning project. And I think that's important for the public to understand, that we will have to walk together on this. We are committed to being transparent, providing information, and keeping the public and the panel advised of what's going on. But there wouldn't be a selection vote. So, for example, on which vendor we chose to do something. And I just think that's extremely important for the public to understand what the panel is and what it is not with respect to the project.
I think that is important. Okay, yes, one more, okay? We'll do this, because we're a little behind, but we'll do one more question, thank you.
I'm interested in...
Your name, please.
Oh, sorry. My name is Lissa Weinman. I live in Brattleboro. I'm interested in the whole imbroglio of how we deal with nuclear waste in this country, and I think, this discussion tonight highlights suing the government for this fund, and we're all in this mess together, and we're in this mess nationally. The last time the policy was rewritten was 1982 with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and that created a fund that was ostensibly going to be used someday in the future for a central repository, which we all know is not really on the horizon. Instead, we're left with these spent fuel pools that are dangerous and that need to be relieved as soon as possible. Everyone has also acknowledged that, but we lack the money to do so. Therefore, I wonder if Entergy would back a community effort to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to allow the state of Vermont to recuperate some of that estimated $112 million that Vermont's taxpayers have paid for their nuclear generated electricity into that fund. It's about $112 million right now as of May 2014. Would the industry back changing that policy, which we all also acknowledge needs to be changed, so that you could recover some of that money that Vermont's already paid in, me, you, everybody in this room, to help expedite the movement of that spent fuel pool into the dry casks?
I'm going to let you sort out the federal question there,
okay.
But I want to object to that everybody agrees.
I know. I was going to say,
the outgoing NRC chair.
Well, and I think only because we're on camera, I would have to say, not everyone agrees that the spent fuel pool is not safe. Certainly not us. But that is not important to answer your question. We do have an issue over the spent fuel management and a national repository, and we are on record as strongly encouraging the NRC to move forward with that effort. As you get to the dollars, I will say it's worth pointing out that Vermont ratepayers didn't pay anything into that fund after we bought the plant, because we were operating as a merchant facility and we were collecting whatever money we collected for the sale of our power out in the industry.
But up to May 2014, there was $112 million.
There's certainly money that may have been paid to the Vermont utilities.
For the purpose of nuclear waste disposal.
Right, so the Vermont utilities who sold us the plant, for money they paid before 2002, I think that's an excellent question to raise with the Department of Public Service about what efforts Green Mountain Power and well, now it's just Green Mountain Power should make to go try to collect that money. And if they did collect that money, make them give it to customers in Vermont. But that's really not an issue for us because we have not been a utility and had a relationship with customers in Vermont in the way that the Vermont utilities did before we bought the plant. So there's a dividing line, a very bright dividing line, which is approximately June or July of 2002. I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but when we bought the plant as opposed to what was going on before that.
Can I just add an amendment there? Would you back a change in federal policy to help remedy the situation?
Well, we have backed at least one change in federal policy, which is no more contributions to the fund, and that became effective
this summer.
Earlier this year. I don't think we're currently pursuing a disgorgement of those dollars because we are still hopeful that the dollars will be spent on a national repository. That is the ultimate goal, and my personal view is that just like we are dealing with the DOE, Congress needs to authorize the whatever activity needs to happen. The NRC needs to do whatever they need to do so that we get to the point where we have a national repository or multiple. I know the Blue Ribbon Panel explored the possibility that instead of one place only in the southwestern United States, maybe it's 2 or 3 in different suitable places around the country. But we are strongly behind the effort to continue that work. And I think that's a better course than to take the money back and have them have to start from scratch. That would be my view, at least.
I would say the better course is to deal with the clear and present dangers first, which the spent fuel pools represent, rather than wait for a pie-in-the-sky day in the future when some repository will appear because nobody wants one.
Well, I have to
But
say,
we've got one right here.
Right. I have to say it's not a clear and present danger, but I do understand the question.
All right, thank you all very much. Appreciate that. I got to keep going, okay? We'll have time at the end for additional questions, but since you helped me so much.
I came up when you said, I'll take a question from over here, and I interpreted that. I thought you were pointing to me, so I came up and sat at this table. I can assure you my comments are very exactly germane to the site assessment, and my comments later in the evening won't have, I think, the value to the panel as they would have now.
Okay.
So with all due respect, may I speak now?
Okay, please,
Thank you.
do it, and we'll make up some time here.
Thanks. Good evening. I am Clay Turnbull, and I'm an employee and trustee at New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution. We're an organization in Brattleboro that has been here for 43 years. I'm speaking tonight not from a prepared remarks that the board has approved, but I think I can genuinely represent that the organization has a lot to offer. And I personally feel underutilized because that's my own personal stuff. Comments to this panel. What is driving the schedule for all of these activities? Or who is driving the schedule? Does this panel have any urgent reason to accept a document that looks at past events, contamination of the site, rather than a current evaluation of the site? Does this panel have a reason that the PSDAR should be in December? Entergy drives the schedule. Entergy needs to build, and this is something I really want to put on your radar, because this is the issue that will last for potentially decades or thousands of years. We don't know. And that is the second dry cask storage pad. That is needed. That's integral for decommissioning to proceed. The schedule for that, Entergy, that is a big issue. That is time dependent for this body to have some input into. Because once that's built, once it's agreed upon, it's there. Many of the decisions you'll make about responding to the PSDAR, a 36-page document, is supposed to be based on the report that you now have access to. But this report is all stuff that happened years and years ago. If I told you, hey, it'll cost you $100 and I'll come over there and I'll clean up the mess you made in your yard, but you had to meet the requirements of the bank that was giving you a mortgage to buy that property, would you want to do due diligence before you bought that piece of land, or the bank would require you to do that? The opportunity to engage Entergy in determining what the site standards will be is being set today because those discussions are being based on this report. So I feel very strongly that this report that was due in December was submitted early, pushing forward the schedule that you need to have input into their PSDAR, which doesn't have a demand on your time. Did you follow? Did that come across clearly? Why did this come in now instead of December? Why isn't it send them back to do their homework and bring in, right now they're drilling core samples of soil at the site, trying to figure out where this second storage pad is going to go. And they submitted an application in early spring to build that pad. Then they asked the Public Service Board, could you delay the proceeding? So we went from spring until fall. Spring until now. Yesterday, I was at the Public Service Board because the docket was going to become active again, and Entergy, at that point in time, after all they waited until that time to say, well, we're not ready to proceed with the pad, the second storage pad. We're still doing soil analysis. So we're going to put that off until late this year or early next year. They have complete control of the schedule unless you take control of it to do some of the important work that you need to do.
Thank you, Clay. And we will have, as I said, next month there'll be further discussion of this, and the panel will be able to discuss more about how they feel they're doing. But thank you for the comments.
Commissioner, just briefly, I'd like to say that it's not true that the site assessment study is only historical. It is current up to the time, and the only soil samples we're taking at the site deal with the moisture content. And I think that there's a confusion about the relationship or the lack of relationship between the two issues. And I know we're running behind schedule. I won't get into it any more than that, but those are at least two things that were not correct about the comments you just heard.
Okay, thank you. Clay, sorry, I'm cutting this off from both parties at this moment. We will have a chance to...
I'm sorry I didn't mention the relationship between the core samples being taken today.
Don't make me use this, please. You can comment generally on this at the end of the meeting if we catch up here, and also next month on this specific issue. I gotta keep moving.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Clay. Appreciate your understanding.
Written comments would always be.
Of course, written comments would also be acceptable. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Okay, so we're going to move on to the topic on the EPZ and offsite emergency response, because we have to hit that at least briefly, and that may also need to be discussed more next month. But let me ask you guys to describe what it is you have done, and I will tell you, I'll also tell folks what the state has done on this topic.
Okay, Commissioner, we have Mike McKinney, who is our manager of emergency planning, and he's going to run through a very brief presentation that addresses the filings that we've submitted to the NRC.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to do it from here?
Just from a microphone would be good, so people can hear you.
Okay, good evening. As mentioned, I'm Mike McKinney. I'm the Emergency Planning Manager at Vermont Yankee. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the submittals that we've made thus far pertaining to emergency planning and relative to decommissioning. Okay, starting off, we submitted the post-shutdown E-Plan license amendment request. This specific LAR, acronym for short, covers Safe Store Period 1, which is from the time we shut down until April 2016. We've also submitted EP exemption requests. They serve to support the permanently defueled emergency plan and EALs. Now, EALs are short for emergency action levels. I think most people are probably familiar with them. Unusual event, alert, site area emergency, and general emergency. We've also submitted the permanently defueled E-Plan and emergency action levels, again tied to the exemption requests. That specific LAR covers Safe Store Period 2, which is from April 2016 until we have all the fuel and dry fuel storage. Okay, a little bit of detail on the post-shutdown E-Plan LAR. We submitted it back in March, and it serves two primary functions. It describes on-shift staffing. We made changes to the emergency plan that will eliminate several of the on-shift positions based on being in a shutdown condition. Also, the emergency response organization, which is the on-site organization, is also being reduced. Should be noted that the changes do not impact the ability for us to assess or monitor actual potential off-site consequences of a radiological emergency. And the appropriate assessment mitigation are well within the capabilities of the emergency response organization, which is located in 3 of the facilities, actually 4 of the facilities, 3 of them mentioned here: Tech Support Center, Operations Support Center, and the Emergency Operations Facility. A little bit more on the E-Plan exemption request. We submitted those back in March of this year also. As mentioned, the approval of the exemptions form the foundation of the permanently defueled E-Plan and EALs. We utilize industry experience, okay, precedent that's been set at Kewanee, Crystal River, Maine Yankee, as well as other stations that are further along in the decommissioning process. And we supported those with various analyses. The permanently defueled E-Plan license amendment request, we submitted this back in June of this year. And again, this covers the period from April 2016 till all fuel is in dry fuel storage. There's significant changes associated with this. Off-site emergency measures are limited to support by local police, fire departments, ambulance, and hospital services as appropriate. The shift in ERO staffing is reduced commensurate with the reduction in hazards. And the emergency declaration, notification, and the ERO augmentation times are changed commensurate with the progression of postulated events. And the fire brigade is defined in the fire protection plan, and that will change over time, based on factors such as reduction in combustible materials on site. As far as the permanently defueled emergency action levels, the EAL classification levels are limited to unusual event and alert, with 3 subcategories of radiological conditions, hazards, and system malfunctions. And we also have, for the SFC, which is the dry fuel storage, we have an unusual event level. Just to recap the timelines, post-shutdown E-Plan license amendment requests, we're requesting approval by January 1st of 2015 with a 60-day implementation period. And this is based on plant shutdown in the fourth quarter and permanent removal of fuel from the reactor. And then relative to the permanently defueled E-Plan and EALs, we're requesting approval by December 1st, 2015 with an effective date of April 15, 2016. And this is based again on fourth quarter shutdown this year and a 15.4 month spent fuel pool or spent fuel period. So with that, that's a brief overview of our E-Plan submittals to the NRC at this point.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions from the panel? Jim?
Mike, if I got it correctly, the permanently defueled emergency plan is where there are two levels, unusual event and alert. In that status, is there still spent fuel in the pool?
Yes.
Then I don't understand why, without getting into the likelihoods, if something were to happen that caused the fuel pool to drain, I could see it going to at least a site area emergency, if not worse. And I would understand why. I don't understand why those aren't in there.
Water. Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry.
It's okay. The question is why are you in a permanent defueled state when you're not permanently defueled?
Yeah.
Or if you are in that state, why are you not accepting the possibility of a drained pool allowing the fuel to go to a site area if not general emergency?
The short answer is that based on analysis, after the 15.4 months, the fuel is cooled to the point of where it takes 10 hours or more to reach 900 degrees Celsius. And that's essentially a benchmark relative to analysis of accepted thresholds for where we can implement this LAR. Without getting into a whole lot of analysis.
So maybe it would be a good time for me now to tell you what the state of Vermont thinks and what we have done on this. First of all, we have filed petitions and challenged with New York State the waste confidence rule that indicates that spent fuel in a pool is as safe as dry cask, or that the risk is so minuscule in both cases as to not be measurable. We oppose that finding and disagree with it. And from that kind of derives all the other aspects of things that we are doing. We Entergy's initial filing with the NRC came out for public notice in July 2nd, because we had by September 22nd. And that is just the on-site piece of this. That's not the second part of this, which still needs to be public noticed at a later time. But even on this one, we filed a motion of intervention and a request for a hearing because we think that we need to have these conversations with the NRC. They have. We had an initial pre-hearing conference this past week, and I believe they're scheduling those hearings for November or December, so there'll be more comment on that. If this is not resolved, if this issue is not resolved, then when, in particular, Entergy files for the exemption to the off-site piece that we've been talking about, we'll be re-raising these issues again. So I just wanted to make sure you understood that while I understand the filings have been made, and I want you guys to know that we are, this is one of the areas that we have had disagreement on, and we've been very open about that. But this is proceeding into an NRC hearing process, then we will be opposing that.
I appreciate that. And then if I could ask one quick follow-up. 10 hours, bad weather, people don't get there. Does Entergy have the option under the NRC rule to include those higher levels anyway? By which I mean the site and general emergency. When you've submitted, it's limited to unusual event and alert, and you said because of the assumption about how long it would take to get to 900 degrees, etc. Does the NRC rule say you cannot include site area emergency?
I guess what I got to say is that for our LAR submittal, we went with the unusual event alert, which is consistent with what the other stations that decommissioned have done. Now, could that have been done differently? Possibly, we stayed consistent with the other stations.
But my question is, will you be required to do that?
I can't answer that.
Any other questions for panel? Chris? Yeah.
Chris, when are the hearings? When are the NRC?
They haven't been scheduled yet.
But did you say you're anticipating November?
November or December, I'm not sure which. Well, Aaron, he's not in this.
Will you?
Yeah, we'll let you know.
Yeah. I guess, I don't know who to ask this to. Maybe Chris, maybe you know, or maybe Eric, or Erica might know, but Homeland Security, do they have an opinion about all this? Because one of the things we have to do is hazard mitigation plans. We work with our towns on our hazard mitigation plans. And it'd be good to kind of know what Homeland Security is thinking about all this too, not just for the planning purposes, but also.
Eric or Joe, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah. Important to distinguish between federal or state Homeland Security.
I'm talking more of the federal policy. There's a number of plans come off the line.
Right. To my knowledge, they haven't taken a stance on that, but that doesn't mean that they haven't, or they have, or they won't, or they will. So it just means that I don't know. The Federal Emergency Management Agency falls under DHS, and they assess all off-site response organizations for nuclear preparedness. And so they have also been asked to comment on some of the first license amendment requests. And they found no issues as it was submitted.
I want to make sure you're saying that the Federal Emergency Response Agency reviewed this application.
They reviewed the first license amendment request because, which details the emergency response organization changes come post-shutdown, which is in January. And as their response that came from FEMA was, and I'm trying to do this from memory, that there was no issues that they could find with the amendment request.
Okay, I will take two questions from the audience, and we're going to please limit your question or comment to about a minute, and we'll try and catch up. But I do want to respect that we want to hear any thoughts you have on this particular topic now. Anyone? Yes. Go ahead. And I'm sorry, Lisa, would you say your name again?
Yes, it's Lisa Weinman. I'm curious how much maintaining the current emergency standards cost, the additional cost it would be, and if the community and the state felt as if we desired a higher level of protection, despite what the NRC or FEMA might say, how much that would add to the decommissioning cost or the spent fuel management cost that you would then probably, again, turn around and sue the federal government for. Do you have a dollar value for the cost of maintaining emergency planning at its current level annually?
Yes, I'll take that question. The answer is, if we didn't make any changes at all, we ran the numbers, and it's at least $100 million over the period through 2020. And over the period through 2020, if you assume, because inherent in your question, I presumed was that we preserve the existing emergency preparedness until the spent fuel pool is empty and the fuel is put into dry cask storage. And on that basis, it was at least $100 million over the next 4.5 years. It may be higher than that if you include other categories of cost, but it's at least $100 million. There is a serious question as to whether anybody would be required to pay for that, because the NRC has concluded that it's appropriate to have these different levels. FEMA has said there's no issues. I think the DOE would have a very compelling case to say, well, you did that because you wanted to do it, you didn't do it because you had to do it, and therefore we're not responsible for that cost. So I would hold out very little hope that money would be recovered. So you put at least $100 million hole in the decommissioning trust fund, and it is probably bigger than that. I'm looking at Barrett because I may be thinking of only be thinking about one or two sets of the license amendment requests and not all three. But I know that the ones we did look at already was around $100 million.
And are any of those costs also approved by the local emergency first responders, the fire, hospital, and police departments that you mentioned? I mean, in other words, are the first responders in the emergency evacuation center getting any of that federal money to help be part of the EPZ?
I don't think they get federal money. I think if we were to make no changes in the plan and maintain the same profile as we have as an operating plant, that money comes from us.
Maybe I can help answer a slightly different aspect of this, which is a lot of that cost is the on-site piece of this that Entergy has to incur to maintain the emergency response that they have, and that's a fair point. In terms of the state and the off-site, the support that we have for the communities and the state emergency management, it's about $4.5 million a year right now. And so that is something that the states could choose to say, we'd like to continue that and pay for it in some fashion. But does that help? Because I think you were trying to distinguish between the two.
$4.5 million annually that these first responders aren't getting anymore once these changes take place, correct?
It's a combination. Erica, do you want to help me out on this? Yeah. Get in trouble?
Yeah. For the Vermont Emergency Planning Zone, you supported, which the state received an annual allocation through a special funding stream established in state statute. The Vermont EPZ is supported to the tune of $2.1 million in this current fiscal year that we're in. It does fluctuate from year to year depending on activity level, but this year is $2.1 million. That doesn't include what goes to New Hampshire and Massachusetts, because they also receive funding to support emergency preparedness activities on a year-to-year basis.
So the state, provides that additional, well, you were saying it's 4.5, so You've been getting federal funds to support the EPZ, but the state's been kicking in.
No, there's no federal funds. There's no federal funds.
It's all state, so taxpayers have been supporting them.
It's an assessment to the power. For the record, my name is Joe Flynn. The money comes from Entergy.
Okay.
The money comes from us. We create a special fund. It's their money. We manage that, and we kind of broker that on behalf of the 6 towns in the EPZ and the first response agencies that are marshaled against this effort. But it is their money. There's no federal money involved. And no state appropriations involved either.
Okay.
Right, and the 4.5 number I was stating included Massachusetts and New Hampshire and their towns as well. Okay, I really am going to ask. Okay, very brief one. Let's move on. Sorry, listen, that was like 3 minutes.
For the emergency dude, Ned Childs, I'm president of the New England Coalition. I was given to believe in a conference call with an attorney in Washington who's representing the 17 environmental organizations which are challenging the waste confidence rule in front of the NRC. So we're party to your action. The 1982 National Nuclear Waste Policy Act does not require any mitigation strategies for problems with dry casks that may develop. Imagine concrete cracks, imagine a poor well, imagine a collection of spent fuel assemblies that is leaking radiation, requiring some sort of mitigation, maybe recasking. And this act is not required, just for your benefit, as my understanding, the federal act does not require a mitigation strategy at a site for dry cask storage unless it's a federal site. And so this site will not be federal. It'll still be an Entergy site until 2053 or whenever, maybe later. And I want to know if anybody's really talking realistically about what you do, because if you're going to take down the reactor building and you don't have your spent fuel pool, I don't believe there is good science on how to. I know they've talked of mobile tubs. I know what they're transporting the fuel from in Fukushima from spent fuel pool 4 to the common waste storage. There's a transport canister that they laboriously load underwater and take the fuel underwater and put it in the spent fuel pool. But with these casks, with these permanent storage casks, the whole tech, whatever you use, what are you going to do if you have a highly radioactive situation, maybe a partial meltdown, some kind of criticality going on in the cask? I mean, have you considered it? Is there anybody talking about what you do? Maybe you could enlighten us.
Well, the casks and the handling and the storage isn't my area of expertise, so I can't answer.
Okay, so it might be an emergency that you wouldn't be able, but maybe Mike call.
Okay.
Well, any idea?
You know, I think that's a hypothetical situation. I don't think we've got an answer to that tonight.
Well, so the triple meltdown in Fukushima is a hypothetical. And you Chapco came out yesterday with a headline that said, we cannot fundamentally solve the problem because it's beyond our ken, because it's too radioactive. We can't go after those spores. You're just going to have to take it 150 years of high levels of strontium release. So I would start to ask your GE friends or somebody, what do we do with the cask? It needs to be recast. Where do we go to Zaluzny or Kruslasmo and say, can you build us a real big metal bin so we can fill it up with water and try to, I would be thinking about it.
Just to be clear, I didn't say that Entergy had thought of it. And I didn't even say that the people at Vermont Yankee had thought of it.
Oh, I thought you did.
What I said was, I don't have an answer for that for you tonight. And we're not going to give you bad information. So we would need to do some more. Chris, unless you have the answer off the top of your head.
No, I promise to really correct.
Right, we got it as being an issue. Thanks, Ned, I appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to move on to just briefly talking about next month's agenda items to the extent that we haven't, and input on, let's say, the next 3 months of what we think we need to work on. And we've talked about a couple of them tonight already. We've talked about really thoroughly trying to deal with the site assessment studies. We've talked about the PSDR commented schedule and opportunities for the future. And we talked about the fact that Ultimately, we owe the legislature a report in January to tell them if we think this panel is constituted correctly or if there are additional needs that we have. So those strike me as kind of the things that come in between now and January, but are there others or other thoughts or issues that people want to see that we try and cover in the next 3 months? Yes.
When are we going to build out the rest of the calendar? Is that what you're talking about? You're going to do?
Yeah. I'm not sure there's a slide 2 to this. I think
Yes, there is.
there is? Okay, good.
About, I think there's 5 slides.
Excellent.
It's just compiling ideas that we have discussed previously.
Thank you, Tony. Are you able to move them forward where you are?
Where's the, Joe, where's the remote at?
Probably at the podium, right?
Okay. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this.
So, why don't you stay there, Tony?
Okay, so I was asked to throw this together this afternoon. So what we have in coming up with the agenda for this evening's meeting, we had a number of brainstormed ideas of what needed to be discussed, maybe not necessarily tonight, but in a future meeting. So as we paired out what we had time to discuss this evening, we left some other ideas on the table. I've tried to categorize some of these. A number dealt with setting up the NDCAP charter that was discussed earlier this evening. So we have obviously incorporating some of the changes that were discussed this evening. I didn't know what those were, but obviously we're going to talk about those in the future. Also opportunities to solicit additional charter ideas. Something that had come up, and we have a little bit of this evening, Bill Irwin is listening in remotely on the proceedings this evening, so we wanted to make certain that, well, maybe this is something that we will need in future meetings. Something I had thought of as well is provisions for needing to cancel meetings due to inclement weather. I don't know how people deal with this up in Vermont, but certainly I do know that in other states, if there's bad weather and your venue decides, hey, we're shutting down all activities, suddenly you don't have a meeting site. So
Tony, we don't have inclement weather in Vermont.
Okay.
We just have weather.
I did want to say, since we did establish a subcommittee for the charter pieces, why don't we move on from that so that
certainly. Some other ideas, certainly we have comments and panel recommendations related to the site assessment survey and the PSDAR. That is going to the NRC. The continuation of the brief discussion tonight on the EPZ changes and what Mike McKinney was just discussing. And also, too, later on, this will probably be December or maybe even January, but the nominations for chair and vice chair in 2015. And then some additional NDCAP subjects that we know are out there, and there's just a list here. At some point, someone asked, well, should Vermont Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security do some reporting on some of the emergency drills that have been done at Vermont Yankee recently, testing, for example, the new emergency response organization. There's also an idea of the NRC and FEMA making a presentation on emergency planning and response organization regulation. Also, the idea of the NRC discussing the process of how a PSDAR is evaluated. Also an opportunity for Entergy to present what's going to happen as the plant is shutting down and defueled. We also have for the panel It is supposed to discuss the status of the decommissioning funds. So we have some ideas in that of what need to be discussed. And I believe this is from Chris Campany at last meeting, the Economic Development Impact Study. And also what has been brought up is there are other decommissioning advisory panels out there, citizens engagement panels out there. What lessons learned can we use from those other panels? And lastly, just a reminder, there is a report that is due to the governor and to the energy committees of both the Vermont Senate and the Vermont legislature on recommendations, the panel's composition and its scope, and a summary of recommendations. And also some ideas for basically panel report, panel trust development activities. And one thing I believe was suggested at last meeting was the idea of the NDCAP actually touring the Vermont Yankee site. And this last item is just a reminder, really more for me. We do need to locate venues for November 20th and the December 18th meeting. We have a pretty good idea that we should have Brattleboro Union High School available on December 18th, but there's still a question mark on December 20th. It does not appear that this venue is available.
Yeah, this venue is not available for either of those two meetings.
That's correct.
So we're looking back at Brattleboro for and the December one, they are available. I thought that room worked out pretty well last time. But we do have to find a different spot for November, so we'll have to work on that. Typically, we've got Marlboro, the grad center down there. Okay, we'll check into that. Good idea. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
That beats the Comfort Inn up on Putney Road.
It's October.
Big deals pub.
That's another option. We might do that. Great. So, thanks, Tony. Those are the ideas that we just came up with. But I'd like to just take a couple of minutes to see if you guys have any others off the top of your head, or if you just want to think about this list and how it might fit into things.
Is this posted?
It will be.
It was just created today, so yes, we'll get it up on the Public Service Department website, as we do with all presentations.
We will do that with all the presentations this evening.
Can I ask you, who's not toured the plant that's on the panel?
Who has
not toured the plant that's on the panel? Everybody that do it?
No. Oh, we have one. Kate, two. And possibly a couple of the other folks have not.
Just to add, I believe Representative Mark was the one who asked, so
I would guess he has.
Yeah.
It's helpful just to get a visualize in your mind when you talk about the different components.
It is helpful. I do recommend it.
Having done it a few times, I would suggest that each time I've been in there with a different group of people, I've learned a little more, and things change, and it would be good to, as much as possible, to have a common view of it.
I think I would look at it with a whole different eye than I did when I first toured it.
So, having done this myself and seen the mechanics that the heroic actual activities that these guys go through to try and get us in and out safely, can you accommodate the panel in one shot, Chris?
We could do it if, my gut would tell me that it won't be convenient, that there's no way, no how we can get 19 people to line up on the same date. So if we want to pick a couple dates and let you choose among a few, we can take smaller groups of 6 or whatever it can turn out. So we can probably pick 3 different dates or something.
There's also a technical open meeting issue if a quorum shows up for a tour.
Excellent.
So if you break it up, it's probably better all around.
Right. So if we all went together, good point, public meeting, and then you're all invited, can you do 75? So, that's a good point. So that probably makes sense. We'll give that some thought.
Joe, do you recall, did we provide
dates or anything at this
We're
point?
looking into that right now, Chris, and we'll extend dates. We have reached out to some individuals, but we'll look at it collectively.
And you'll serve the hot dogs on Fiestaware?
All right, thanks. Other thoughts, or do you guys just want time to look at this and think about it on the web? Okay. All right, then let me take the last 5 minutes and ask if there are any other comments that the folks out there would like to make. I'll start here and then I'll go there. Go ahead.
Amy Schollenberger. I just have a suggestion that on your public website for the CAP, that you link to Entergy's website so that people know that that one exists as well if they're coming to the official panel website.
Right.
Because right now I think they're.
We don't do that yet?
I didn't see it when I was there the other day. I don't know if it's been updated.
Okay. We did try and link it, but maybe we didn't do that.
Yes, we have links to specific items. Some of the items that are on the Public Service Department website right now are simply links over to Entergy items because it's difficult to copy them.
But you're suggesting a link
It
to
just
their
seems that
general
Entergy
site.
is adding their own materials that you may or may not link to.
Okay. Well, we're happy to.
We get that. I'm sorry.
Does Entergy link to this site?
Do we have a link?
Yes, we do.
Great. Yes, sir. Thank you.
If I may, Howard Schaefer, Enfield, New Hampshire. I was a startup engineer at Vermont Yankee, which I'm very proud of and have worked in support of that in the past through other organizations. I'm also a licensed professional engineer in nuclear engineering in Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. With your permission, I'd like to resubmit for the panel some points of interest I made for the Vermont State Nuclear Advisory Panel in October 2012 after I testified before the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee in the spring on a report by a certain Mr. Alvarez from Washington on safety of fuel pools. Mr. Alvarez had been there testifying, and Representative Hebert had arranged for me to testify in rebuttal. In his report on, this reference is here, everybody can look it up. In his report, he said, "We have considered generic PWR pools. Additional issues may well arise when specific PWR and BWR pool designs are analyzed." And further, he goes on to say they didn't look at BWR pools specifically. And just reading this short paragraph, for safety of pools, armor outside exposed walls and bottom against projectiles. He said, and this is something that gets raised by people in these meetings. The water and fuel in the pool provide an effective shield against penetration of the pool wall and floor from the inside. Should take care of aircraft. Mr. Alvarez says, it should be possible to prevent penetration by shaped charges from the outside with a standoff wall about 3 meters away that could cause the jet of liquid metal formed by the shaped charge to expand and become much less penetrating before it struck the pool wall.
A double wall.
When I was in Vermont Yankee as a startup engineer, and every time I've been there since, they already have a standoff wall more than 3 meters away from the thick concrete fuel pool wall. It's also a reinforced concrete wall. It's called the outside wall of the reactor building. So to me, it looks like the original design of Vermont Yankee met what Mr. Alvarez is asking for now. It's been there all along.
Are you sure the fuel pool's at that level and not above it?
Absolutely, having been there when they were building it, and many times since. You're right. Also, quickly is a copy of that testimony with points about the fuel pool, and also the executive summary of the NRC's technical study on spent fuel pool accident. But the question that was asked here goes to the heart of what division has been from the point of view of design, engineering, operation, regulation, and emergency planning. It's not only what could happen and what are the consequences, but how long does it take and what can you do about it? But if you leave out, as the gentleman said, how long it takes, you've taken away all engineering design and you're in a world that isn't real. The fire department in Brattleboro certainly operates on the basis of how long does accident take to develop. If the FAA goes to operating on only what could happen, airplanes could crash, not what are the odds, which is what regulators do, or automobile recalls, we'd never allow another airplane to fly if we only dealt with, well, it could crash.
Howard, try telling that to the Japanese.
I will.
No way they're going to do.
Gentlemen, okay. I'm not going to debate this.
Thank you.
Finish, thank you. And we're happy to receive in writing whatever it is we'd like to provide. Thank you. Any other comments, thoughts?
Yeah, just real quick.
Go ahead, Nick.
NDCAP, NDCAP is way too close to handicaps.
Yeah.
And LAR is way too close to liar. You got to work on your acronyms.
We will work on our acronyms. I mean, we only have a page of them so far. We'll keep I know it's a problem.
Okay.
All right, well, yes, Chris.
Do we need to let folk know about the chairing of the next meeting?
Oh, yeah, we should. That's the good news. John, you might want to make sure that you're not subbing next time.
I will do that, Chris.
Unfortunately, I have a conflict next month, and as does Chris, the vice chair. So David Mears has graciously offered to chair the next meeting, and since it will be on bulk on the site assessment, and he's got the most expertise on that, I think that'll work well for you. And so, John, your assignment is to make sure David doesn't have it.
I'm going to keep him healthy and well.
Excellent.
Is everyone okay with that? I mean,
Yeah, it really is up to you.
In terms of venue, I think I made this clear last month. I will be in Texas on November 18th.
Yep.
And I need to be able to call in.
We will, particularly if we're in Brattleboro, we think we can do a go-to meeting type arrangement with the Wi-Fi there. We're going to test it out and try it. Sorry, that's for December, but I'm sure if we can get to the Graduate Center, they probably have the same thing. So we will make sure that works. You won't have to be sitting on a cell phone in the corner. So, thank you. Any other? Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for your patience and your engagement. And the panel, thank you as well. And we will see
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Right, and you need a motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Aye. And I get to do the gavel thing again.